Hello and welcome back to UML Operator, and in this episode we're going to talk about baselining practices as part of our modeling practices series. And I have to break even this episode in our installments into 3 parts. So in our first part here, we're going to talk about planning baseline strategies so that you're able to more effectively manage your versions in Sparx. Why to baseline, when to baseline, things to think about when baselining, some do's and don'ts. I'm going to be very brief on that one. Reasons to baseline, I want to cover those. Some cases to set up for the third part of baselining practices. Demonstration, that's going to be in the third part. Where to baseline and meaningful naming and ensuring that you're describing your baselines just like you do on your elements, your diagrams, and your packages. So you need to have meaningful, try to stay unique naming because you're going to be using the same names when you're exporting your reference data and even when you're exporting your baselines. So let's get started. Baselining and or versioning can be valuable when modeling. Your models may be constantly changing, so we need to talk about planning your baselining strategy, using packages effectively, the use of meaningful names and descriptions in your baseline, documenting changes and the use of notes, comparing before restoring, the use of version control systems where possible during your baselining, and the planning and conventions that you're following, coordinating with team-based modeling, automating where possible, back up the repository regularly, and educating your stakeholders. The first one we're going to talk about is planning your baselining strategy. And you may have the same plan for every project or different plans for different types of projects: small, easy, medium, large, code delivery, project only, research and development, and more. You can baseline at any package level. However, I want to talk about or ask some questions, and this is not all inclusive, but the reasons I believe that we need to focus on start with why baseline. A project manager may baseline at the project level, and this is just below the root node, because they want to track what has changed since the last update. They may want to do a compare across the project, small or big. I usually don't recommend doing this on extremely large projects because of the amount of time it's taking right now to process all of the data that is in the SQL instance. Now, when the project manager may be using baselines for compare reasons, they may be looking just to understand what has changed. Green is new, blue is there's a changed, and they may want to scan the elements. And you can see this is a rather large project, and the scroll bar here still has a long ways to go to understand what's taking place. Another reason may be to track stakeholder progress and status. So they may be looking through change elements, doing a compare to baselines between previous versions to see what's changed, when it changed, and why it changed. Another reason why to baseline may be that you need to do a version. In this particular case, this package with this red indicator next to it is a package that's under version control, and you've learned to do this in this channel. So what we're going to do is we're going to export this file out to whatever the repository is that we want to do exchange, and we will version the project using whatever our convention is, whether you're using file-based in this particular case, or you're using a version control system. Another reason may be for model exchange. I'm going to keep this folder up here. In this particular strategy, we're using a file-based shared file system to version our exports so that they can be exchanged, so that another modeling project or effort or Sparx instance can import this native XML into theirs. And so we want to have a baseline for this particular project, this particular package when we're going forward. So we'll do a baseline on it, stating that in our notes, this is because we're doing a native XML export and we're putting it out into a share repository across disparate Sparx instances. So we briefly talked about why to baseline, but I want to talk next about when to baseline. And the first one is when something has changed. So something changed today, something changed before I went on a lunch break. I might be in a team environment. And when I return from a lunch break, a day off, or a vacation, I want to understand what has changed on the work that I've been doing. Another one is when to baseline is where did changes take place? In this particular model here, we have requirements that are sitting in its own namespace, and then we have package elements here that are part of building blocks where we're drawing realization in implementation for these requirements. So we want to understand, well, where did changes take place? Requirements engineering department, solution architecture, application architecture, and baselining helps to understand what changed and when it changed. Another reason when to baseline is you may be working through formal version control. We've shown you how to set up and connect to SVN, Git, and there's certainly many other version control systems. But when you're going to check out or check in a particular project or package in your version control system, you may want to baseline, just like with Exchange, before you do a checkout or you do a check-in. So in the particular case of checkout, what you're going to be doing is importing that effort into your project. And just like with Exchange, you can baseline before you make such changes, or you can baseline after you make such changes. So as I had mentioned a moment ago, you want to make sure that you're baselining. So we're working on this particular model. We're going to find the project so we can get to the package. You can see that the package is under version control, and I'm getting ready to export this and share this with the team in a separate file share. And I'm not using a version control system. I'm simply going to use a file share. So I am going to baseline, and then I'm going to export the file. And the person that's importing this file into their project, they're going to check a particular box that says, hey, I want to baseline the package after the import. So they'll come out and they'll import the file into their project, the XML file, in this case, native XML, and they're going to baseline right after that import takes place. So we talked about the what and the when to baseline, but let me go over some do's and don'ts. So we're looking at this particular model. I'm going to right click in here. I'm going to find in browser, and it's right here. And you can see these are only diagrams. So if I export this particular package, these elements are not going to show up because these elements are not in the namespace that I'm exporting. Even if I baseline this particular package and make changes to these elements, they're not going to show up in the baseline. And when we get to the demonstration portion here, I will show and prove that point. So one of the key don'ts in baselining, and let's go to the building block model here, right click and find this in the browser. We can see that there is a parent folder called Solution Approach. And this is one, of course, of many namespaces in this project. So this is a parent namespace. I want to say package, but namespace to me is a better reference of this particular effort, topic, main topic, at least to the solution architect in this project delivery. The package underneath it and the packages underneath it, these are subtopics. And so I'm going to open up solution analysis. And in here, there are other sub packages. The primary package here that I would focus on in baselining happens to be this sub package called building blocks. And this diagram, and there are two diagrams in this particular model, one exposing the exact same elements and their tag values. This one just exposing the block view, including some particular attributes that we want to focus on within this block or class diagram. So we're baselining on this package. Control B, you've learned that. And we're baselining for various reasons, primarily around when we're making changes, notable changes, and if and when we wish to export. Now we're in a SQL environment here, really doesn't require any exchange because other modelers can log into this effort. But what we want to do is share with the team as well as ourselves what has changed since we did something. So we can look at, here we're making a baseline saying, hey, we've completed. We're done. The solution is approved. And we're going to do a baseline on it. Then after the fact, we can come in and show differences going, all right, we made a completion, but has anything changed? In this particular case, we see a lot of new realization connections. And so you're able, when baseline, to say, are we really completed? It doesn't look like we're completed. And you're able to do further analysis and track changes as you're moving between the project and future releases of the same building blocks as you're going forward. However, does this mean that I can't or shouldn't baseline at this sub-package level? The answer is yes, you can absolutely do it at that package level, but you may not be exporting this entire namespace, if you will, for whatever reasons, for versioning or exchange. You just want to be able to see, well, what has changed since we did other work in the namespace or packages? And you're able to very quickly, using the baselining capabilities and compare capabilities, to go through the entire work effort and say, well, what has changed in this namespace called solution analysis, and then make determinations of how you're going to proceed going forward from there. Then the question may come, well, as a solution architect, okay, I've said I'm done and I'm completed. I have all of this intelligence and work within these other sub-packages. Can I baseline at this so-called parent level or parent namespace or package? And the answer is absolutely yes. And you may do it for various reasons. Now, in a moment, we're going to talk about descriptions and notes and things like that. Having clear, concise descriptions and notes on the changes you're making, just like any version control platform where you're checking in code or any other files, you must comment on those changes when you're doing that. And we're going to talk a little bit more here in a moment about making sure you've got practices in place for doing that. Next, we're going to talk about the importance of using meaningful names and descriptions, notes, in our modeling, especially when leading up to versioning practices. So what is a meaningful name? It is a name that expresses the purpose in a short and concise manner. Know that the name can be repeated or will be repeated if you're not having a good naming convention. For example, you may call something solution approach and have the same name of a topic, a parent package, a sub package that says solution approach. So that's going to happen. If you ensure that you have a meaningful name, especially if it is a subtopic or a topic under a main topic, the namespaces and the naming convention can help separate them, but ensure that you have a meaningful name. So the tip is, when you create a name, ask what will happen when you return to the subject, whether that's a package, a diagram, an element, etc. If you return a day later and have to ask, what was I doing here? What was this topic? then you did not have a meaningful name. So it's helpful to have good practices in place for your naming conventions and how they should be applied. So we need to understand that when we create a package, whether it's a root node, if we go up here to the top, there's a root node. It's just model by default. You can rename this if you want. I usually don't unless I'm going to have multiple root nodes. But the parent package for this entire project under this root node has a meaningful name. So it is essentially, let me go back to it, our KMS project release 1. For me, and the team agrees, this is a meaningful name because when you come to it, whether it's a day later, a week later, or a year later, people know, oh, this is the package, the parent package within our Sparx instance for this particular project called Release 1. Now, most companies have a project management system that's creating a unique ID, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or alphanumeric reference number, and that's appended to the name, which really makes it unique and meaningful, especially when you start mining all of your project program data across your company or shop, or even your own personal research and development. Having a unique and meaningful name also helps when you do things like export or in creating a pattern. So in this particular case, we exported this building block diagram. Let's find in browser right here. It's just simply called building block. Now that's pretty ambiguous and not meaningful, but it's under solution analysis, so that when you're stringing these naming conventions together, it basically is, this is the solution approach for our solution analysis, and the building blocks, architecture building blocks, if you're using TOGAF, for this project solution approach. So when we go to export this for versioning reasons, for exchange reasons, the convention we're using is saying, well, what type of exchange do we use? Native XML. And then the name of the package is building blocks. And then in our convention, we use a timestamp. So this date here is 09/2025, which is the 20th of September 2025. So having a good naming convention helps you understand, is this an exchange XML file, or is this a baseline XML file for building blocks? And we'll talk more about you backing up your baseline in just a moment. Outside of names, the next important thing is to make sure that you're putting good descriptions. So if we go to this, what we're calling the parent package for the solution architect, there's a very short sentence in here that describes, well, what is this namespace? What is this package? Solution analysis. You can be as verbose as you want to be, but be sure that you're at least putting one descriptive sentence in there that explains what the namespace or package is. When we go to building blocks, very short description of what this is. Now, this helps when you're returning to a particular package or namespace. What was this about? What was I doing? And then if you're further describing things like the diagram, the elements, you're telling your story. It makes it a lot more effective, repeatable, and defined when you're returning. So outside of having meaningful names, describe, put content, comments. So having good practices for naming conventions and practices for describing and providing intelligence is critical to your modeling and your project delivery. All right, we're going to wrap up at this particular point in part 1 of baselining practices. We talked about planning your baseline strategy, that being mission critical. We went over using packages and namespaces effectively, and we talked about the use of meaningful names and descriptions in your notes. In the next part 2 of baselining practices, we're going to talk about change management. We're going to talk about compare before you restore. And as I had stated in the beginning of this video, then we're going to jump into version control, coordination with team-based modeling, educating your stakeholders, automating where possible. I think that's very efficient for consistent and reuse of defined conventions, and backing up your repository regularly. When I'm saying backing up your baselines. And we're in a SQL database. Those baselines are in a SQL database. So you're able to do bulk backups of your SQL tables, and your model administrator or your database administrator is going to take care of you. So I look forward to getting into that next episode. And then the last episode is taking everything that we've learned up to that point, and we're going to demonstrate some simple baselining practices going forward. So until that next episode, thanks very much for watching. Leave comments down below and questions as we're moving through these 3 parts. Look forward to that very much. And yeah, happy modeling.